Have you ever caught yourself marveling at a face so distinctive, so rugged that it seems carved from stone itself? Maybe you've watched an old Western late at night, and your gaze was irresistibly drawn to that lean, angular presence lurking in the background. Suddenly he steps forward, towering, dark-eyed, and you think, now that's a face that's lived a story. Well, get comfortable, because today we're digging deep into the life of a man whose countenance alone could shape entire roles, Jack Palance. It's easy to remember him as the tough-as-nails gunslinger or the grizzled cowboy you've seen in so many classic films. But behind that bristling screen persona lies a deeply human story, filled with triumph, heartbreak, cultural roots, and yes, a fair few controversies along the way. Today we'll journey into his past, watch him box in smoky rings during the Great Depression, go along as he endures the fierce realities of World War II, see him transform himself into a masterful Hollywood villain, and then watch him mellow just enough to become a beloved comedic presence and painter in his later years. To really understand Jack Palance, we need to step back into the early 20th century, a time when America was forging its identity through a melting pot of immigrants arriving from every corner of the world. Jack's parents were Ukrainian immigrants who settled in the anthracite coal region of northeastern Pennsylvania. Imagine dusty roads lined with modest wooden homes, the day's hush broken by the shift whistle of the coal mines. It was a time when entire families were shaped by the demands of backbreaking labor and a relentless focus on survival. The Great Depression would soon cast its long shadow over the country, creating widespread hardship and forcing many families to make unthinkable sacrifices. In these tight-knit communities, life revolved around the mine. Fathers, sons, and sometimes daughters would trudge down into the dark, uncertain depths each day, hoping to earn enough to keep food on the table. Against this backdrop, young people learned quickly that every penny counted, every morsel of food was precious, and the future was never guaranteed. Into this crucible stepped the man who would one day become known worldwide as Jack Palance. But at birth in 1919, he had a very different name, an unmistakably Eastern European moniker that belied his future career in Hollywood, Vladimir Palahniuk. Growing up, he was immersed in the language and traditions of his parents' homeland, and though he would eventually adopt America as his stage, Ukrainian heritage remained a wellspring of pride and identity. He was part of a generation of first or second generation Americans who, while navigating the complexities of life in a new land, never quite shed the echoes of the old country. Pennsylvanian coal towns had significant populations of immigrants from Eastern Europe who brought with them not just labor, but also folk songs, religious festivals, and a fierce sense of community solidarity. Over time, these communities produced some of America's most remarkable talents: musicians, athletes, and even Hollywood legends. Little Walter grew up with that dual identity. English was learned alongside Ukrainian. The coal dust was as present in daily life as the smell of homemade bread. His father's days were spent in the mines, and occupation as treacherous as it was necessary. So, from the earliest moments, our future star understood what real work entailed. Nothing was handed to you. You earned it, sometimes with the sweat of your brow, sometimes with more than that. This environment shaped Palance's mindset, rugged self-reliance, discipline, and a certain cautiousness about the world. Even as a child, he saw the stakes of everyday life. The community around him was no stranger to accidents, labor strikes, and the constant fear that a breadwinner might not return home. That awareness certainly left an imprint on him, and it would later influence the roles he chose and the intensity he brought to them. Long before Jack Palance was plastered on movie posters, a tough young man from Pennsylvania was forging the iron will that would carry him through war, professional fighting, and eventually the bright stage lights of show business. As the Depression years ground on, many families had little choice but to get creative about how they made money. The Palahniuk household was no exception. For a time, young Walter discovered that stepping into the boxing ring could be lucrative if you could stomach the hits. Boxing was a popular spectator sport in those days, offering a short, if bruising, path to cash for tough athletic men willing to risk a black eye or two. He started boxing under the name Jack Brazzo. Some variations exist of the ring name he used, and quickly earned a reputation as a formidable fighter. Now picture these underground or low-level organized matches. The ring roped off in some smoke-filled venue, the crowd roaring for blood. Palance's future cinematic aura was already on display. He was tall and lean, with a face that might have been sculpted from granite. Opponents underestimated him at their peril. He actually racked up a respectable record and was even rumored to have knocked out several well-known local fighters. But life in the ring was both physically and psychologically punishing. Even so, Palance found it preferable to the coal mines. A few rounds of boxing might mean enough money to cover his expenses for weeks if he won. But there was a constant risk, a gambler's tension that one unlucky punch could shatter everything. In interviews much later in life, he spoke of those boxing days as a formative period. The focus required to stand toe-to-toe with another man who wants to take you down is unparalleled. It sharpened his instincts, taught him discipline, and forced him to trust his own strength. These qualities would later merge with his natural sense of presence, contributing to that intense on-screen aura that made producers think, now that's a perfect villain or anti-hero. Yet, as tough as the boxing ring was, destiny had other challenges in store. With World War II looming, a new chapter would open, thrusting him into even more dangerous territory, the skies of war. When the United States entered World War II, like many of his peers, Palance enlisted. Some sources suggest he joined the Army Air Corps, aiming for the bold adventure of flying. Others detail him serving as a bomber crew member. Military records can sometimes be contradictory or incomplete, but what remains consistent is that Palance endured a major, life-altering incident while serving. He sustained severe injuries. Some accounts attribute them to a plane crash that led to reconstructive facial surgery. In certain interviews, Palance joked that the surgeons who worked on him gave him the face that ultimately launched his acting career. He also sometimes spun that story as an exaggeration to amuse reporters. But the kernel of truth remains. His face bore the marks of war. This is where the question of identity grew even deeper. He was still known by his birth name or some variation of it. But Hollywood soon beckoned, and with that call came the necessity of a stage name. Jack Palance was born, a streamlined, sharply resonant moniker that fit perfectly alongside the likes of Gary Cooper or John Wayne. But behind the name was a real veteran carrying physical and emotional scars. That post-war period in America was a time of optimism, expansion, and a booming entertainment industry that craved fresh faces. Palance, tall, intense, and with an angular countenance that could radiate menace, found acting a natural fit. While many of his contemporaries displayed a suave, clean-cut look, Palance stood out as something else entirely, the embodiment of lurking danger, real or implied. So there he was, navigating auditions, trying to find his footing in a movie industry that had no shortage of young hopefuls returning from war with big dreams. What separated him was the aura he projected, a cross between a wounded soldier and a raw, untamed force. Little by little, film roles began coming his way, each bigger than the last. And always, there was a sense of the man behind the mask, forging forward with the same discipline and grit that had seen him through the darkest days of war. He first gained attention on the stage, studying acting with a seriousness that belied his tough guy reputation. Encouraged by directors who saw potential beyond brute strength, Palance threw himself into the craft with the same intensity he'd brought to the boxing ring. Method acting was becoming the rage, and Palance's inherent realism meshed well with that style. He could tap into authentic emotions, often fueled by memories of hardship and loss, powerful material for any aspiring performer. Broadway provided his first major break. He earned a role as the understudy for Marlon Brando in A Streetcar Named Desire. Yes, the same Brando who would become a legend in his own right. When Brando couldn't perform, Palance famously stepped in, delivering a performance that left many in the audience in awe. It was a fleeting moment, but the buzz it generated was enough to catch Hollywood's eye. He soon made his way to film. In 1950, Palance scored his first movie appearance, playing a small role in Panic in the Streets, directed by Elia Kazan. Although the part was modest, critics took note of his grim magnetism. By 1952, he was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor for his role in Sudden Fear, starring opposite Joan Crawford. It was an almost surreal achievement for a man who only a handful of years earlier was fighting to stay alive in war-torn skies. But it was his performance in Shane, 1953, that cemented his Hollywood status. He portrayed the ruthless gunslinger Jack Wilson, whose mere presence sent shivers through the viewer. Even with minimal lines, Palance delivered a performance that stole scenes from lead actors. Audiences found themselves mesmerized by his slow, deliberate movements, the coiled tension behind his eyes. That was Palance's gift, the ability to embody a character's menace without seeming to try. However, the Hollywood studios rarely saw beyond that menacing aura. He was typecast over and over again as the villain. He fought it at times, yearned to demonstrate more range. But the industry, famously risk-averse, often wanted him in the same mold, the brooding bad guy with a chilling sneer. And for all his frustrations, Palance couldn't deny that the paychecks were good and the recognition was building. He was, almost overnight, the go-to face for roles that required an undercurrent of danger. Behind the camera, Palance was still the son of Ukrainian immigrants, still the kid who had felt the tremors of the coal mines and the heartbreak of war. That humanity, often overshadowed by the menacing characters he portrayed, would surface in moments of vulnerability. He remained quietly proud of his heritage, occasionally dabbling in philanthropic efforts aimed at Ukrainian causes. He also let slip, in interviews, glimpses of the poet's soul that hid behind the tough guy facade. What many fans never realized was that Palance nursed a lifelong love for painting, poetry, and other forms of art. When he traveled for film shoots, he often brought along a sketch pad or watercolors, finding solace in the quiet act of creation. He once said that painting was a kind of meditation for him, a chance to escape the noise of the world and slip into a realm where he had full control over the image. In the 1980s, he even showcased his artwork in galleries, surprising admirers who only knew him as a cinematic tough guy. His pieces often featured landscapes, abstract shapes, and sometimes delicate figures, bearing little resemblance to the violent worlds he inhabited on screen. Observers recalled the tenderness and subtlety in these works. It was as if the man you saw in Shane or The Professionals had drained away, leaving behind the introspective soul of an artist. Likewise, his relationship with poetry mirrored this quiet, introspective side. He would occasionally quote lines from his favorite poets or slip references into conversations, especially in later interviews when he felt more comfortable revealing himself. It's said that in private moments between takes on a film set, he'd sit in a folding chair reading Rainer Maria Rilke or reciting lines from Robert Frost to calm his mind. These glimpses into his artistic passions were rarely publicized. The media loved to play up the intimidating old-school tough guy aspect, and Palance himself rarely tried to contradict that public persona. He seemed content to let fans see whatever they needed to see, but behind the scenes, those who knew him best, family, close friends, would speak of a man who could be startlingly gentle, even shy. One longtime friend recalled Palance softly playing classical music in his trailer between scenes of a gritty Western, the contrast of which was both beautiful and slightly surreal. These lesser-known facts help us understand that Jack Palance was far from a one-dimensional Hollywood cowboy. He contained multitudes: soldier, boxer, painter, poet, dedicated father, and, eventually, champion of Ukrainian heritage. This complexity added layers to his performances, even when he was cast as the archetypal villain. You could see something behind his eyes, a flicker of introspection that suggested a far richer life than most antagonists display. For all his success, Palance's personal life was not without its share of heartbreaks and challenges. He was married more than once, and the demands of an acting career with its constant travel and erratic schedules created strain in his relationships. Hollywood has a knack for chewing people up and spitting them out. Palance was no exception. One rarely discussed anecdote concerns a time in the 1950s when he quietly took a hiatus from filming after a family emergency. Some sources suggest he lost a close relative and needed the time to grieve in private. Rather than exploit the tragedy for publicity, he retreated from the spotlight, returning home to Pennsylvania for a stretch. Friends say he spent much of that time walking the old coal town roads, reminiscing about simpler days, grappling with how far he'd come from those humble beginnings, and questioning whether the price of fame was worth it. When he did return to Hollywood, he brought an even greater intensity to his roles, as if the personal sorrow had deepened his capacity to portray tormented characters. Directors noticed the shift. While many of his earlier performances exuded raw menace, this new phase carried a haunted quality. In roles like Attack, 1956, where he portrayed a combat soldier grappling with cowardice and betrayal, you could sense the emotional depth that surpassed mere acting. There was lived experience there, a man grappling with war memories, personal grief, and an uncertain identity between stardom and ordinary life. Palance also shouldered a sometimes fraught relationship with the studio system. He was known to speak his mind, often to the displeasure of producers who preferred pliable stars. He refused to accept roles he found demeaning or too shallow, leading to disputes with major studios. One rumor holds that he walked away from a potentially lucrative part in the late 1950s because he felt it perpetuated negative stereotypes. While we can't confirm every detail, these stories align with the man's reputation for independence and integrity. Hollywood would not always reward that stance, but it endeared him to fans who appreciated authenticity in an industry often short on sincerity. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, Palance's star continued to shine in a variety of genres. He tried his hand at foreign films, including spaghetti westerns, which were exploding in popularity. Directors like Sergio Corbucci cast him in roles that capitalized on his ruthless image. Even there, amidst a sea of gunfights and dusty town squares, he managed to inject complexity into characters that might otherwise have been one-note villains. However, at home, he struggled with the typical illusions that come with stardom. Being recognized everywhere he went, labeled as the bad guy, and dealing with the relentless demands of press interviews can wear on anyone. Palance had a love-hate relationship with the Hollywood machine. He appreciated the craft, but despised the phoniness he sometimes encountered behind the scenes. During red carpet events, he often appeared somewhat aloof, curtly greeting reporters, clearly happier when the cameras turned away. A longtime publicist once mentioned that Palance would go out of his way to avoid Hollywood parties, preferring to spend time with a small circle of trusted friends or on a quiet ranch property. There, he found solace amidst the open landscapes, reminiscent of the farmland that dotted Pennsylvania during his youth. That need for open space and solitude was a thread woven throughout his entire life. Whether in the boxing ring, on the battlefield, or under the hot studio lights, Palance's sense of self was rooted in the vastness of nature and the calm it provided. Fans might be surprised to learn he often turned down promotional opportunities that required him to manufacture a more glamorous persona. He'd be more likely to talk about his vegetable garden than about the glitzy Hollywood parties. And if a journalist pressed him about how he maintained such a dark and fearsome image, he'd sometimes respond with a mischievous grin, "I'm just an ordinary man with an extraordinary face." While never descending into scandal of the sort that might define a tabloid headline, Palance did find himself tangled in occasional controversies. One such incident involved his Oscar acceptance speech in 1992 for Best Supporting Actor in City Slickers. Famously, he dropped to the stage floor and performed a series of one-armed push-ups, showcasing a near superhuman fitness level for a man in his 70s. It was a spontaneous moment, apparently aimed at poking fun at host Billy Crystal, who had joked about Palance's advanced age. The audience roared with delight, but behind the scenes, some critics felt the stunt overshadowed the ceremony. Palance, for his part, seemed genuinely amused by the fuss. Another controversy sprang from an offhand remark in which Palance criticized certain Hollywood directors and producers as soulless. Some took offense, accusing him of biting the hand that fed him. Yet if you consider his background, a child of immigrants, a war veteran, a boxer, perhaps it's not surprising he saw more to life than the artificial glitz of Tinseltown. He later clarified that he was referring to an attitude of profit above all else, not attacking any individual personally. But the incident added to his reputation as a plain-spoken maverick, unafraid to call things as he saw them. Additionally, there were rumors about on-set quarrels, with some co-stars complaining Palance took the role of villain too seriously, becoming abrasive or difficult during filming. Close friends often defended him, claiming he was simply methodical, intense, and not inclined to small talk. If he came across as gruff, it was more about focusing on the role than any personal hostility. Nonetheless, these stories fed the public perception that Jack Palance was a man with whom you didn't mess. By the late 1980s, Palance had turned increasingly to television roles and smaller film parts. Many in Hollywood, prone to short memories, assumed his days of mainstream relevance were behind him. Then along came City Slickers in 1991, a comedic gem that cast Palance as Curly, a caricature of the gruff cowboy persona he'd spent decades refining. The role was comedic gold, a wise move by the filmmakers who recognized the comedic potential in Palance's tough guy archetype. Viewers were enthralled. Seeing the usually menacing Palance deliver deadpan lines with a twinkle of humor was both refreshing and oddly reassuring, as if he was playfully telling the audience, "Hey, I'm in on the joke too." The Academy seemed to agree, awarding him the Oscar for Best Supporting Actor. That memorable push-up stunt became a symbol of Palance's irrepressible spirit. He was, at that moment, a testament to the idea that you're never too old for a reinvention or a well-deserved spotlight. Capitalizing on that resurgence, Palance co-hosted a revival of Ripley's Believe It or Not and made various guest appearances in television shows and interviews. Audiences who'd only known him as the stoic gunfighter from Shane or the menacing antagonist from countless westerns realized he could be disarmingly funny and lighthearted. This late-career Palance attracted a new generation of fans, bridging the gap between black and white cinematic classics and the more vibrant style of modern television. In interviews around that time, he was more candid about his heritage and personal life, willingly sharing tidbits about his Ukrainian background, his love of art, and his experiences in the war. This willingness to open up suggested that, in his later years, he'd found a certain peace or acceptance, and fans gravitated to that more intimate glimpse as it validated the notion that behind the iconic scowl was a thoughtful, multifaceted man. Something that often went underreported in the mainstream press was Palance's devotion to Ukrainian causes. In the latter part of his career, as tensions flared in Eastern Europe and Ukraine struggled for greater recognition, Palance quietly donated to cultural organizations and sometimes lent his celebrity to events promoting Ukrainian heritage. He recognized that his parents' homeland was often misunderstood or overlooked, and he took pride in shining a light on its rich traditions. On one occasion, Palance famously refused an award from the Soviet Union, apparently in protest against the regime's treatment of Ukraine. While some might see this as a footnote in his biography, it resonated deeply with those aware of the complexities of Soviet-Ukrainian relations. Palance's stance was more than mere symbolism. It was a tangible gesture of solidarity. He'd grown up hearing stories from his parents about the trials of their homeland, and the memories of those stories clearly never left him. When Ukraine eventually gained its independence, Palance joined diaspora communities in celebrating. There's a touching anecdote about him visiting a Ukrainian cultural festival in the United States where he chatted with performers and sampled traditional foods, all while wearing a beaming smile. Locals who met him that day recall his warmth and genuine interest in their stories. He even spoke a few words in Ukrainian, surprising those who assumed he had entirely lost the language in his Hollywood life. In time, age caught up with Palance, as it does with all of us, but he never stopped exuding that formidable presence. Even in his later years, with his hair gone silver, he carried himself with the same straight posture he'd had as a boxer. Friends and family members observed that his sense of humor grew more pronounced, as if he was making up for all those years of playing the dark villain. He became the doting grandfather type, always ready with a joke or a playful tease. One particularly moving story involves a family gathering in his final years. While surrounded by his children and grandchildren, Palance recited some lines of poetry, this time one of his own compositions, about the fleeting nature of life and the importance of remembering one's roots. He had tears in his eyes when he spoke those words, and his family realized just how profoundly he valued the path he had taken, from a coal miner's son in Pennsylvania to a celebrated actor, war veteran, artist, and cultural advocate. While many Hollywood stars chase eternal youth, Palance seemed to embrace his age, his wrinkles, his well-worn hands. He also garnered a newfound respect from younger actors who saw him as a living link to the golden era of film. Some even sought him out for mentorship, hoping to glean whatever wisdom he could offer. He was never one to hold formal acting classes, but he'd occasionally invite young hopefuls to his ranch, spending afternoons discussing the craft, telling war stories, sharing honest critiques. His approach to mentorship, much like his approach to life, was straightforward. He once told a young actor, "Don't lie on camera. The lens sees all. You have to show truth, or the audience will never believe you. Over time, Palance's health began to decline. He slowed down his public appearances, though he made an occasional cameo or accepted a Lifetime Achievement Award from film societies and ethnic organizations. Living with the normal ailments of old age, he still seemed unbreakable at heart. The man had, after all, survived war, plane crashes, boxing matches, and the vicissitudes of Hollywood. But by the mid-2000s, it became clear that his strength was waning. He passed away on November 10, 2006, at his home in Montecito, California, surrounded by loved ones. The official cause of death was reported as natural causes, fitting for a man who had always attributed his remarkable longevity to a natural lifestyle, complete with a good diet and a strong mind. Hollywood lost one of its true icons that day, though in some ways he had already become more legend than man. The news tributes poured in, headlines proclaiming Hollywood's toughest cowboy rides off into the sunset, and farewell to the last great villain of the golden era. Yet, the truest reflection of his legacy might be found not in newspapers, but in the hearts of those who recalled that towering, stone-chiseled face, the secret lover of poetry and painting, the quiet champion of Ukrainian identity, and the father who balanced film sets with family dinners. One of the lingering questions about Jack Palance is whether he was tragically typecast or whether he capitalized on a unique persona that made him stand out. Some film historians argue that he could have displayed a wider range had Hollywood not insisted on pitting him as the perpetual villain. Others contend that his portrayal of villains was unmatched and that he took a character archetype to such compelling depths that it was a gift in itself. Then there's the debate over just how much Palance's war injuries shaped his face, and by extension, his career path. Was his distinct visage more genetics than war-related surgery? Palance enjoyed the mystique and occasionally egged on the rumors. Sure, a plane crash can do wonders for your jawline, he'd tease. The truth is likely a blend of both. He was born with striking features, and the war's physical toll only accentuated them. Historians also still discuss his political stance, particularly regarding Ukraine, and how it may have influenced certain roles he chose. Some see his refusal of Soviet accolades as purely a moral decision rooted in family history, while others label it a public relations move that boosted his image. Whichever angle one takes, the fact remains. His conviction to stand by his parents' homeland has aged into a poignant reminder that cultural identity can persist even in the glare of Hollywood lights. In the broader context of film history, Palance's significance is multi-layered. He was part of a post-war generation of actors who brought a grittier realism to the screen. Along with contemporaries like Marlon Brando, Montgomery Clift, and James Dean, he helped transform acting styles from the stagey, polished performances of the studio era into something that felt immediate and raw. But unlike Brando or Clift, Palance wore the badge of villainy. He shaped how generations to come would portray the cinematic tough guy or anti-hero. And that's all for today's video. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up, let us know your thoughts in the comments section, and subscribe so you won't miss out on future uploads. See you next time.